Hi there. We are planning a podcast next week around COVID and how our experience in some ways is alike. We're all experiencing this pandemic, but it is not at all the same. And so we've asked some of our outsiders into that conversation with us and want to give you a bit of a sense of what that will be like. I'm Tuesday. I'm going to be joining that conversation from Columbus, Ohio.
Hi, I'm Brona. I've been working with the outside for about 14 months now, and I'll be offering a perspective from what it looks like in Glasgow, Scotland.
I'm Summer, and I also have been working for the outside for about 10 months, and I'm from the US Virgin Islands, live on the island of St. Croix.
And I'm Tim Merry. I'll be coming to you from my home bay in Nova Scotia, far east coast of Canada. We're looking forward to all being together and sharing some of our different perspectives and analysis of what's going on with COVID-19. Join us.
So next week on the podcast, we wanted to dive in a little more deeply into this idea that we are having a shared experience with this pandemic, right? It is hitting all corners of the earth. We are sharing kind of a collective anxiety about what will this be? How will we keep ourselves healthy? What will be a post-COVID world? And it can be quite easy in that kind of framing to gloss over that even though we are having a shared experience of a pandemic, what we are experiencing within the pandemic is not in some ways at all alike. And so we wanted to dive into that a little more deeply. And so we asked a couple of outsiders to join us from different places. And so Brona had to drop off, but she will be with us on the podcast. And we just began to have a conversation around what does COVID look like where you are, right? And so Summer, can you just kind of briefly, what does COVID look like where you are?
COVID looks like where I am, everybody's at home. We are also under like self-containment, physical distancing restraints, and I think that's like a silent marker that I think the world is using social distancing. Brona mentions physical distancing, and I think those two things are quite different in what the long-term effects for society are. So we are physical distancing. We have not many cases, but truthfully, my lens is on what happens after. Being a territory that I sometimes refer to more often in very bold spaces as a colony. I think one of the things in this is that we have different lenses of looking at where the focus is. There are people working on the now, and there are also people who are thinking, depending on your lens, your perspective, and your work, the next step after we get past this and how it affects us structurally.
Yeah, it's so amazing just to be in the moment of it, and the personal roller coaster of the ups and downs of great days, and then like absolutely terror. I had an all-time low yesterday. I'll tell you, it's like one of the worst days I'd had. And then there's other days where you feel like you can handle this and you've got it and everything's going to be okay. So there's that whole kind of like immediacy of the personal roller coaster. There's the kind of business struggle, just as a business owner, and you're running your own organization, Summer, and of like, how does this affect our business, And then there's just like questions in our community of like, how are people in our community staying connected? What are the potential businesses going under in our community during this period because they just can't keep themselves open? Like, are we going to be coming back to the same community in terms of the services that are available, let alone are we able to service the needs of kind of COVID-19 as they're arising in our community right now? Like, I really, there's the immediacy and the urgency of what we're dealing with right now, but also that kind of like forecasting into what is the world we're going to be returning to. And it's not going to be some like sweet reality where suddenly we all just open doors again and then it's business as usual. Thanks very much, folks. Like there's a real you triggered me to think about some of that. There's a rewriting of our script that needs to be happening right now, both in terms of our day to day, but also in terms of what we might return to.
Tim, that just made me think you recently shared on social media a kind of a study looking back on the influenza of 1917 through 1919 and how cities responded. And as you just said that, because there were just really radically responses in cities, right? From those who had like really large spikes and then contained, to those who had really large spikes and never contained, to those who had double spikes. And so we know even city to city in the US. Like the experience is going to be different. It's going to be different based on how those who govern respond. So I happen to live in Ohio, which has had a very aggressive response to this virus. Like our governor is one of the leading governors in the nation who has looked at the science and said how it's going to go. Brona is in the UK. They have not. I mean, like it would be ridiculous to say they haven't had an aggressive response. They've had just such a late, lackluster response. Her experience of the virus is quite different. I don't know how you would characterize Nova Scotia or the US Virgin Islands. How would you characterize the governing response to the virus?
So for me, there's a saying that we say in the Virgin Islands, or like, who feels it knows it more, right? Who feels it knows it more. It's not, so there's like, you can have empathy for a thing. I think that our government is working to take this as serious and be as responsive. We have only had one death as COVID related, but because of our geographic isolation, because of our recovery from the hurricanes, I think that our government is trying to be quite progressive in making sure that it doesn't spread, because we have limited capacity now. I think the interesting part is, as we talk about the response, it's going to be equal? Is it going to be equitable? You know, like, how do we serve the least among us, the most marginalized of us in this time? And because I don't think that equity conversation isn't running through our policy and through our like formal institutions, I think there's the potential for a huge miss there, where lots of people could possibly fall through the crack.
So I feel like I feel really good about the Canadian response and in the Nova Scotian response. I mean, I think the Rob Strang, who's the medical officer of health here, we worked with him years ago on the transformation of the public health system, and he's just like a brilliant human, you know. And Stephen McNeil has like come out, and who's the premier of Nova Scotia. He's come out with like a "Stay the Blazes home," which has immediately turned into like a whole bunch of social media memes and stuff like that, you know. So there's this been pretty folksy response from our premier, you know, but a very, very competent, measured, calm, but firm response from the medical officer of health. So I actually feel really, really good about those. And it's felt very graduated. I think Nova Scotia and Canada had time to see what happened in Italy and in Spain and in the UK and in China, and be in touch with those governments and then design the response. So it's felt very graduated to the point now where we're in a really significant lockdown. So I actually feel pretty good about it. I feel good about the governing response. I don't necessarily feel great about some of the citizen response. You know, in the podcast, I share the story of someone being on our streets asking why everything's closed down and where they can get some fish and chips. You know what I mean? And like, and so there's things like that happening, you know. But in general, I actually feel pretty good about it. I feel like people are being pretty responsible, and I live in a certain class bubble, my friends. You know, I just do. Like, my home bay is a certain place with a certain access to wealth, and the relationships I have are somewhat limited. Do you know what I mean? So I have a limited experience, and you know, that is not going to be a shared experience with all Nova Scotians, right? So I want to name that. And in the same breath, I just want to say that some people in the UK haven't, although Brona will very clearly articulate the UK response as lackluster, I think there are people who haven't experienced it that way. I've got friends on Facebook and on social media channels who feel like the UK response has been measured, robust, and effective, and who stand fully and wholeheartedly behind Boris Johnson in his leadership, but also in this time of his own isolation. So I think part of what we're all dealing with here is like the multifaceted, multi-layered perspectives we all have, and like, you know, we're all dealing with the what do they call, the echo chambers of social media.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And so there's something about this podcast. What I got out of doing this podcast with you all was it just began to like break down the little walled enclosures I live in, and I suddenly got to understand it from the perspective of a Northern Irish Catholic living in Glasgow, you know, from Tuesday's perspective in Columbus, Ohio, from Summer's perspective in the Virgin Islands, and my perspective in Nova Scotia, and get a bit of a mashup of that. And so I think what was great about recording that podcast was it actually just began to break down some of the quite limited perspective I have because I'm living in isolation or I'm reading media. And I thought I just really loved that about it. And yeah.
Well,
Yes.
I want to say that, sorry, Tuz, but the podcast and this conversation also is helping me trigger and understand how privileged I am that I work in a work from home situation. So people who have telework service, who don't have printers, who don't have computers, and don't have international relationships to inform their perspective, I get the benefit of your lived experience. And we do this quite naturally because we're always in calls together. But that in itself is like a privilege that the average Virgin Islander doesn't have. I'm not talking to people from Glasgow and Ohio and Mahone Bay who have ties to the UK to help inform their understanding of how this is affecting everyone, right? We live quite in a bubble of the geographic isolation. And I guess there's pros and cons to that. And the cons stand out quite often, but I am just now examining my privilege in the moment of how easy to go through this is for me because of the prior existing setup we had with our relationship and work.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, for sure, as outsiders, we're pretty fortunate through this. So many people are just right away losing jobs, losing income, having to set up a whole new way of working. I read a meme recently, and we need to close. I know that, but I read a meme recently that said, "You're not working from home. You're at home during a pandemic trying to work."
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank God! Thank you.
Clarity.
Oh my God! Exactly.
So and that's true. And the truth is, we do have a little bit of a leg up in that way. We've done this for a long time, and so yeah, there's a lot, and it's really different. And I think for me, it's one of those things where we always have to, we talk a lot about holding the paradox. The paradox is there is an opportunity now when our faces are all gazing in the same direction at this pandemic to really do something different, to choose to respond differently, to choose to come out the other side differently. However, I think that possibility is really decreased if we somehow think that just because our gaze is the same, we're all seeing the same thing, or we're all having the same experience. And so part of what we want to do in this podcast is just four of us, just an in of four, hear the different experiences we're having. We would assume that is just exponential across the globe. And so just a little peek in.
Love it. Any final words, Summer?
Yeah, I want to say this is going to be a shameless plug, right? But this is what the outside does well. We have these types of conversations that hold multiple perspectives. That's our job. Getting in and talking about the multiple layers that overlay to make a system or a situation clearer so people can be innovative and generate new ideas or decide how we can reimagine or stay the same. And so as an outsider, I think that the reason why I can dissect this conversation so well is because I have the privilege of doing that as part of our work in a relationship with amazing people who share the same value system for the multiplicity of universes that exist in one situation. So yeah, and thank you.
Love it. Thank you, Summer, so much for joining us. I mean, I think both Tuesday and I left the podcast just feeling unbelievably grateful for the quality of humans we get to work with.
Yes.
So folks out there, come and join us. Here's some perspectives from different parts of the world in such a way that maybe it will inform yours and the conversations you're having with the people who are closest to you. See you then.